I'm Nancy Birdsall, President of the Center for Global Development, and I and my colleagues are very delighted to have this opportunity to interact with all of you on this initiative called Partnership for Growth. My colleague will be introducing our distinguished ambassadors in a few moments and the members of the officials of the U.S. government that will be participating. I'd just like to say a few words by way of introduction to the afternoon. This is about the Partnership for Growth. I suspect that many people here in the room know a lot about it. I just say it's a great thing that the U.S. government is focusing on the idea of broad-based growth. I think the focus on the Millennium Development Goals of the last decade or so has muddied the waters a little bit on what the development community and the global community is really aiming for. That was certainly not the intention of those who've defined the Millennium Development Goals, but too often they've been interpreted as sectors in which there should be investment rather than as the outcomes that are goals for people, which as they've been interpreted as means rather than ends of a broader process of sustained development, where actually growth, if not always sufficient, is absolutely necessary. So it's only in a few dusty corners, I would say, of the development policy space that there's still debate about this idea of growth versus better lives for people right away. I want to, in that spirit, add that it's very encouraging to see the analytic tools that the U.S. government and the partner countries are bringing to bear. The constraints to growth idea that's been out there, perpetrated in a good way by Danny Roderick, Ricardo Hausman, who are associates and non-resident fellows of the center. It's good to see the government trying to find a way to make sense of our policy tools in this country spread across so many agencies. Many of you will know that I've been working hard with the team at CGD to encourage the U.S. government to use all of the policy tools it has at its disposal in the development approach the U.S. is taking to Pakistan in particular. Not yet a partner country, but who knows. And I'm really anxious to hear more about the guts of this Partnership for Growth approach, how it's going so far, and what is really new and different about it compared to, for example, what places like the World Bank have been thinking and working on for many years in their approach to growth that's sustainable. I now have the great privilege and the fun, in a way, of introducing an old friend and colleague, Gayle Smith, who is the Special Assistant to the President and a Senior Director at the National Security Council. Gayle is responsible for a key set of issues at the NSC, global development, of course, democracy, stabilization, and humanitarian assistance issues. She was previously a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, co-chair of the Enough Project, and she is the co-founder of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. I think there are probably people here who've been very much engaged in that Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network effort. During the Clinton administration, Gayle served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the NSC, and as Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Agency for Development, for International Development, USAID. Before that, Gayle was based in Africa for over 20 years. I'm surprised there are 20 years plus all these accomplishments, frankly, behind the Gayle we all know and love, as a journalist covering military, economic, and political affairs. I want to say also that Gayle was a key member, and this is a little bit of bragging about the Center for Global Development. She was a key member of CGD's 2004 Commission on Weak States and National Security, what are now called fragile states more often, and national security, along with people like Susan Rice. And finally, in her role at the NSC, I know that the project director of that commission actually was Jeremy Weinstein, who is a former postdoc of the Center for Global Development and who worked in the White House with Gayle. In her role at the NSC, I know that Gayle played an important strategic thinking role in shaping the messages that the president gave on development in his history-making speech, really, in 2009 at the UN General Assembly. First time, I believe, that a U.S. president has spoken specifically on development issues, where a lot of the principles that I think we'll be hearing about today, embedded in the Partnership for Growth, were first enunciated, really, by the president. And I know that Gayle has been working since then to make real and operational those principles. And I suspect that the Partnership for Growth is one of the ways that she's been doing that. So with that, Gayle, where are you? You have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be here for a number of reasons. It got me outside on a beautiful day. I always love coming to the center, where we have many friends and even more ideas. I'm particularly pleased that we're joined here today by our guests from the governments of El Salvador, the Philippines, Tanzania, and Ghana, because part of what the Partnership for Growth is about is us doing this together. What I'd like to do is just say a little bit about where the Partnership for Growth came from, what it is to us, and what it might portend. And then the other reason I am very happy is that you will then hear from an extraordinary set of colleagues. We were joking upstairs that we could briefly after this have an interagency policy committee meeting on any number of issues. We all work together quite a lot. But one of the greatest joys for me in this has been not only working with fabulous colleagues, but seeing so many leaders on the Partnership for Growth emerge from across our agencies. So you will be in very good hands. Briefly, where this came from, as you know, we did a presidential study on development policy early in the administration, in which many of these agencies were involved, culminating in a presidential policy directive, which was the basis for the speech that Nancy referred to that President Obama gave in New York. Now, in that policy directive, and you all know enough about how our foreign assistance system works and how many agencies we have, and you've all seen the spaghetti chart that Lael Brainerd did at Brookings, to know that we had to grapple with not just what is our policy in development terms, but how do we do business? How do we get effective outcomes? How do we take advantage of all the resources and people and agencies we have and drive to a singular outcome? So we did spend a fair amount of time, as Frank and others who participated will attest, on really looking at how we do things. So one of the things the Partnership for Growth is about is doing things differently. It's a bit of an experiment. It is modeling, I think, what we learned in the presidential study and what was codified in the PPD. It's not an initiative. It is a different approach to how the United States government pursues its development policy, and critically in partnership with the countries with whom we're working. The second thing we grappled with, so we finished the study, the PPD was announced, and it was all right, so what do we do about it? We have been doing a number of things to implement various pieces of the directive, ranging from instituting better evaluation policies across the government, driving policy with evidence of data. I cannot tell you the difference in just a couple of years from a lot of our meetings on development issues. And it's not just Frank who says, what's the data behind that? There are a lot more people asking those questions and a lot more evidence and analysis brought to the table. So that, the president asked us to really take a serious look at innovation and how we could bring that to scale. So there are any number of things that are under implementation. This one, in many ways, models the policy directive. Because our premise here, number one, is that where you get sustained development outcomes is where you have certain ingredients in place. You all know this. But that has a lot to do with leadership and the commitment of those driving the development process, both in governments and in communities and civil society, to achieving those outcomes. So we said we want to try this partnership for growth. Let's identify some partners. And we took a serious look around the world and asked ourselves, where are the emerging markets? Where are the countries that are putting skin in the game, that have the ingredients right, still have challenges, but where we've got partners with whom we could say, hey, do you want to try to do things a little bit differently? And they might say yes. And very fortunately, all 4 of them said yes. And so we began working very quickly with El Salvador, the Philippines, Tanzania, and Ghana. So what are we doing that's different? First of all, we're driving with the discipline and not with the resources. It's very, very easy, and I think this is not just limited to government. I think this happens in the advocacy community. I think this happens in the broader policy debates, to say, what are you going to do about development? How much are you spending? What are you going to do about development in country X? What's your budget? Well, that doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to know. I mean, there are a number of examples we can look at around the world where if your only metric was how many dollars we'd spent, we might have some emerging markets in places we don't. So we set about to start with a fundamental, rigorous analysis. And we drew on the work of a lot of people. We drew on the experience of the MCC and constituted teams to do analyses of the binding constraints to growth. But we did something very different. We drew from different agencies in our government. And we also sat down with our partners. They identified their key experts, and together that analysis was done. That's very different. There's always been and has been an increasing amount of consultation. But it's not commonly the fact that the 2 governments do this analysis together and that they turn the analysis over to real experts. So that was very different. And I will tell you how different it looks and feels to somebody like me. We'd walk in the morning and we'd have a meeting on Tanzania, and we'd go into the Situation Room and turn on the screen, and there were our colleagues around a table in Dar es Salaam. And we'd go back and forth on the analysis. It's a very, very different. Second, in drawing on other agencies, now sometimes we have very big meetings because we do have a lot of agencies, but I think we've drawn on the strengths of different agencies. I think we've overcome the notion that everybody has to do everything. You will hear from Jose Fernandez, who, as a diplomat, has been of huge significance in our work in El Salvador. Different agencies have brought different tools to the table. So what do we end up with? We end up with an analysis that is on the constraints to growth, and specifically on the binding constraints. So it forces a discipline and a set of priorities. Because you can argue that pretty much everything is a constraint to growth, so we should do everything and spread our money and our resources around against everything. No, in this case we said, what are those things which, if unblocked, could really unleash the sustainable, inclusive growth that we and our partners seek? So we had priorities. We also had a neutral set of facts. And I don't want to speak for our partners, but it's my observation from where I sit that makes a very big difference. It's different if I say to you, based on what we know, you should do this, than if together we have come to a conclusion around facts and evidence that no foul, no blame. If you fix that, that could really change. So that's very different. The third thing that's different is we built the expectation that this would require commitments from both sides. That from our partners in these 4 countries, there are policy issues, there are regulatory issues, there are issues of prioritizing, there are all sorts of issues of how they allocate their human and other resources. But also for us, what are we going to deliver? What are we going to do to help to unblock these binding constraints? And what are we going to do that isn't just assistance? Now, one of the things we did, partly budgetary, but I think also deliberately, was we didn't make this about, all right, so let's just find a big pot of money and deploy that. We said, no, what are the resources we have in our government? We have OPIC, we have EXIM, we have Commerce, we have USTR, we have USDA. We've got USAID, we've got MCC, we've got Treasury, who am I forgetting? We've got a huge number of agencies that can bring expertise, heft, resources, all sorts of development and financial tools. How do we use our role as the United States to leverage in the participation of others? The private sector, think tanks, experts, associations, NGOs. So we've taken it upon ourselves to deploy a broad range of resources behind our part of the agreement. Now, you'll hear from my colleagues that each of these steps is codified in analyses, in action plans that are signed by both of our governments. I think by way of significance to our government, Secretary Clinton signed the Partnership for Growth Agreement in the Philippines. Jose in El Salvador, after the two presidents announced the Partnership for Growth, we were very pleased to sign an agreement with President Mills when he was here, and we've got quite the plan for our friends in Tanzania, where we've just seen, and I don't know whether we have this here, an extraordinary document I was just saying to the ambassador, which is a joint analysis by Tanzania and the United States that's a really serious analysis that is, again, something that's very unusual for how we do business. I just want to say a couple things about where does this go from here and what are the opportunities and the challenges. I think we've already seen that this is catching on a little bit in other parts of our government and other parts of the world as we face development challenges. We've had people come into our offices, Carrie Lowry is here, who's done an extraordinary amount of work on this, and say, could you help us PFG this country? Can we do that PFG thing? How does that work? When we were looking at some future budgets and how we allocate certain kinds of assistance, we've worked closely with OMB to say, what are some of the ways we're doing business that we can codify in how we allocate certain resources? Now, has it overtaken everything? No. But I think it is taking root in some fundamental important ways. That said, I think the tests for us and our partners, but I'm quite confident, is that it's going to require all of us to make choices, all of us to set priorities, to give each other absolute support as each of us makes those hard choices, and to demonstrate to our constituents and to our communities that we can actually deliver the outcomes we seek to deliver. I will tell you that I'm very excited about everything we're doing as we implement the PPD, Nancy, and you're right. It's a pretty constant effort in our offices. Of the many things I've had a privilege to be involved in, I think one of the greatest game changers could potentially be, if we're successful in institutionalizing this and proving that it works, a partnership for growth that is built on mature, equal relationships with partners who are committed to development and with whom together we can get the outcomes that I think we all believe are possible. So I would like to, I think I turn over to Todd, and in doing so, just offer a very sincere vote of gratitude to all my colleagues here. I say this not just because they're here. I think the single thing I may be the proudest of is, as I said at the beginning, we've got a whole new generation of leaders on development across the U.S. government, and for that, we're very thankful. Thank you.
I'm Todd Moss. I'm Vice President for Programs and a Senior Fellow here at the Center. I'd like to ask our 7 panelists to please join me now on the stage. Please be very careful. There are stairs on the side. Right. So while they're taking their seats, I want to say how thrilled we are that we were asked by our friends in the USG to host the public launch of the Partnership for Growth. I also know that I don't want to disappoint Gayle and her colleagues by just cheerleading a new initiative, but also asking some of the tough questions. I think that's one of the reasons they came here. All of you can see that we've got quite a crowd up here, so it's a little window into maybe some of the interagency coordination problems or challenges that the Partnership for Growth faces. And I think all of you also have the full bios, so I'm not going to read those. But just to tell you very quickly, We have from my left, going to the side, we have Frank Wiebe, Chief Economist with the MCC. We have Ambassador Alchul, the ambassador from El Salvador. We have Eric Postel, who's the Assistant Administrator at USAID in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Agriculture, and Trade. We have Ambassador Mayar from Tanzania. We have Jose Fernandez, the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. We have Ambassador Quisha from the Philippines. And at the far end, we have Ambassador Ajikum from the Republic of Ghana. We're very thrilled to have all of them here today. This is how it's going to work. We've asked, since there are so many participants, everybody wanted to have a chance. We did not want 7 prepared statements. That would take up probably more than the time we have with us today. So I'm going to ask each of them a question. Hopefully we'll have relatively short answers, which will allow us time to then open it up to the floor. So I'm going to start with Frank. Frank, we just heard from Gayle that the core principles of the Partnership for Growth include using evidence to inform allocation decisions and then to measure results. So how does this work in practice, and what are some of the challenges you've faced? And in particular, how is the constraints to growth analysis, how is that working in terms of implementing that? I did talk to some of our friends and colleagues at Harvard that have pioneered the constraints to growth analysis, and they said they've actually had a tough time when it came to doing it in countries. So Frank, you're up first, and I'm going to say we didn't have 7 mics, so we're going to have to pass the baton. Frank.
Well, thanks, Todd. I think we can say that the process has not worked perfectly, but it's worked well, worked better, I think, than some people might have expected. In fact, I think some of us may have read some of the literature on how hard it would be to work as a whole of government and may have been made more pessimistic by the literature from some writers than the reality has been. Those of you who know Todd's writing would know I'm talking about it. No, but the reality is it's not easy. But it has worked well. And starting with the constraints analysis, and to give the kudos, make sure people know what we're talking about. The literature talks about growth diagnostics, and Gayle described it extremely well. It's a process that is evidence-driven. It's an effort to identify the core priority or priorities, a small number of the most important challenges that limit private investment in economic growth. Getting to the point where people agree that's the challenge we're going to work on, and that we're going to approach it not from opinions but from evidence, is itself a game-changing starting point. Then if the analysis is done perfectly, the reality is when you do that analysis, people will come to slightly different conclusions. That said, the process leads you towards a consensus around a small number of things and an agreement to set aside other things. That process worked extremely well. The way Gayle described it, which was important, was that it included multi-agency teams on both sides. It was also a way of keeping people honest. That is, we know that this process always includes politics, but the reality is that politics pushes different people in different ways. And if you have a group of people working together with the shared understanding that evidence and analytics don't always trump politics, but you have to work in that space and everybody's working together with a team, you get much closer to that right answer, and you're constrained away from going to the wrong direction. If I can just give one short anecdote. In one country, we had a team that approached us and said, we don't really want to do the constraints analysis. We know what our priorities are, and here they are. There are all 18 of them, right? And so understanding that countries face 18 or more, every country faces challenges. That's a different question than what is the thing you need to approach first with the best expectation of driving growth. So the ability for us to get past that 18 problems in one country, but the reality is that was reflected in a number of places, to get to the point where we have these analyses, which are made publicly available, that both countries sign on to, is an extreme accomplishment. One last word is where we're going now with the progress and implementation. I think that's going to be equally important. We're early on because we're just starting to put the strategies in place, but the agreement that the performance will be monitored and the accomplishments will be measured, again using evidence, is again something which is a fundamental change in the way governments have done business in this development space, and I think represents a real opportunity to do better. Like I said, I can't claim that we have already accomplished that, but the fact that we've agreed to do that on both sides is a very significant accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. My next question is for Ambassador Quisha from the Philippines. If we can get him a mic, please. Ambassador, your country's constraints to growth analysis has found that two areas are the focus of your Partnership for Growth agreement. That's governance and fiscal space. Now, these are relatively broad, so I'd be interested in hearing how is the constraints analysis shaping your country's engagement with the United States?
Well, what is unique about the collaboration between the U.S. And the Philippines is that the process that was undertaken was rigorous, high-level, and multi-stakeholder consultations conducted by a group of U.S. and Philippine state departments and agency representatives that produced a constraint analysis, which in turn formed the basis of the Joint Country Action Plan, which has already been rolled out. And this addresses those constraints, specifically improving regulatory quality, addressing or strengthening the rule of law and anti-corruption measures, and improving fiscal performance. Fiscal performance, for example, has been a perennial challenge for the Philippines. And learning the lessons of development cooperation between the Philippines and the U.S. for the last 50 years, the PFG was consciously designed to complement and support the elements under the Philippine Development Plan 2011 to 2016 of the Aquino administration, and attuned to the President's social contract with the Filipino people. And finally, the Partnership for Growth leverages the resources and expertise of both governments to come up with the top priority and high impact programs and projects, demonstrating the following dimensions of the partnership. This partnership illustrates the Philippine government's commitment to economic reform to foster a more conducive investment environment. And in the case of the U.S. government, the engagement reflects the strategic importance of the Philippines as a staunch ally in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hand that mic to Eric, please? Eric, as you heard from Frank, I've written some of my skepticism about the whole of government approach, including that it seems especially difficult in the U.S. context where the government is so large, it's so sprawling, and there's so many fragmented mandates across the agencies. Now, the PFG seems possibly to be one exception that's in a way proving the rule. So how is the PFG fundamentally different from the normal interagency process?
This process, of course, brings, as was mentioned, up to 15 different agencies in any one country. The exact set of agencies has varied, driven by the analytics. So if you have constraints that deal with roads, you have certain people coming to the table, whereas in other countries it might be power, and now DOE's at the table or whatever. So, so one aspect is that who's at the table is partially affected by the analytics. The second thing that the analytics do is it helps people get away from what I've described as enabling us to avoid the situation around a home family dinner table of asking parents to choose which is their favorite child. Because we're sitting there and not talking about each agency preserving their own equities, but what agency can do what around the analytical challenges that are laid out from the constraints analysis and with the consultations that went on with the governments, with private sector in both countries, and so forth. So that fundamentally starts changing the nature of the dialogue. And I think the last thing is that it's very focused on then trying to achieve the results that are in the Joint Country Action Plans, the JCAPs as we call them, because we have a specific set of things that are identified in combination with the countries, and then trying to figure out, well, how do we solve those? And then knowing full well that there's a whole monitoring and evaluation effort and public indicators. And so, for instance, when I was in El Salvador last month and at the press conference, the first question was, well, you signed the Partnership for Growth a month ago. Why? What is happening with the crime rate, which was one of the first things. So there's an aspect to that that's a little different than I think in standard interagency discussions, and always focused on either the constraints, the actions, or the results.
Okay, thank you, Eric. The next question is for Ambassador Mayar, so if you could just pass the mic. Ambassador, you represent a country, Tanzania, that has for a very long time been a donor darling, which means that you had lots of experience working with crowds of unruly and uncoordinated donors. Tanzania is, of course, famous for instituting the mission holiday, where they ask for, please, a break from visits from donors so we can have time to prepare our own budgets. And so the U.S. government by itself, as you can see, can sometimes be its own crowd of unruly, uncoordinated donors. So I won't ask if the PFG makes the USG easier to deal with, but I would be interested in how the constraints analysis is helping you with your own government priority setting. For example, is it feeding into Tanzania's national budget?
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know whether the donors have been unruly, but it's always difficult when it comes to looking into the agenda as it was agreed, development agenda as it was agreed, and how it was performed, and whether you actually reached the milestones that were established. And always there is a different opinion from the government and the donors, and the unruly may be coming from there. But the Partnership for Growth is a very, very good initiative for us. And you have seen the book that has been a product of our team and the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam that has set out the priority areas. And this is very critical for us, because you can actually, even for me as an ambassador at this side, you know which area to focus. And also the State Department knows which area to focus. In February, we were in Dar es Salaam together with State Department and the Corporate Council on Africa with a power sector team. And the power sector is one of the first areas that have been identified in the PFG for us to deal with this. And we know power, if we can unlock the power problem, it will be one huge step towards trying to kickstart the economic growth that we're looking for. And for me also, as I try to reach out to American investors, I always will be making reference to the 4 priority areas that we want to invest. I am doing, for example, a VIP safari that is a leisure and business safari for executives from America. And my reaching out to them, I will show them those areas that we identified. And this fits in also very well with our 5-year development plan that was launched by President Kikwete in July last year, which again sets out priority areas and specifically says, this is not just like the PFG. We will not say we have all the money that we need, but we will be in this one together, private sector and the public sector. And the private sector will be invited to be by showing them what is in there, what are the potential for investment in Tanzania. And that's why the Partnership for Growth is a very good program. It is a program that will help a country like Tanzania to come out of a donor recipient relationship, but a partnership for business. As long as we can encourage the private sector to continue to come to Tanzania, and I see it coming, because when you talk to the private sector in the US to come to Africa, they have more confidence where they see their government. And I think for us, it's a very, very big plus, where we can now go and say, follow your government. And not only that, the US government is telling its private sector, we will encourage you to go there, and the state agencies, the Exim Bank, and all OPIC, and all other related, they will be with you. You will be able to actually contract, and when you contract, if you need funding, the funding will be there in the normal private sector funding, but your government is behind your back. And I compare this with what President Obama said in his State of the Union when he was doing the analogy of the special agents who took out Osama. He said they were confident to walk up the stairs of that house because they knew someone was at their back. And in this one, both our government and investors know we have a powerful partner behind us. And I think it's a very, very good initiative. We are very happy for it here in Washington, D.C. and in Dar es Salaam. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You mentioned the power sector, so I'm going to turn to Ambassador Ajakum from Ghana. We can pass the mic. The power sector is also the focus of the Partnership for Growth with Ghana. I've been working on Ghana for almost 20 years, and the power sector has been a priority of the government as long as I can remember. It's also been a country that's actually had trouble, where American companies, private power producers, have had a difficult history in Ghana. It's still an area where demand for power is rising quickly. I was just in Accra a couple of weeks ago, and it really has the feel of a boomtown. And so my question is, what's different now about the emphasis on power, and how is the PFG, how is that making a difference in the government's plans to reform and grow the power sector?
Well, good evening to you all. Thank you very much. I wish you were sitting here rather than standing over there. Because I believe from where you stand, you have almost all the answers to the question that you raised yourself. But let me begin, I'll try to be very short. Let me begin by putting the question, the issue of power in a biblical context. You know, when God created the earth, it was all darkness. And he said, let there be light. So I think it is appropriate that for us, in this partnership for growth, we have identified 4 core areas, namely the power sector, of course, land use, finances, and water and sanitation. We have come rather late in the day of the 4 partner countries we were allowed to sign on to the program. But I can assure you, we've taken a lot of time to do the constitutional analysis and come to the firm conclusion that we ought to place deserved emphasis on power, the energy sector. At the moment, we cover throughout the country about 72 to 80% on the national grid, and we have a large number of communities which are without power. So our determination through this partnership is to extend by the year 2015 power to almost every part of the country. Now, the various areas, especially now that we have discovered some significant amount of oil and oil-related gases, it is our intention again to make sure that we utilize the gas to produce power, generate it, transmit it, and distribute it to reach all corners of the country. I would say that through this partnership, in identifying power as the major priority area, not forgetting about the others, we hope that the majority of our people will have access to open many opportunities, many doors to development, so that in a short period of time, we will be able to see the quality of the life of our people would have been increased. Now, through this partnership, we are encouraging American businessmen, especially the small, medium-sized entrepreneurs, to come and invest in the power sector, because there are huge opportunities. We believe that this partnership is a major initiative. The model is working very well with us. It has helped us to identify the core areas where we need need to place emphasis if we want to develop and improve the quality of life of our people. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Jose. If you can pass the mic to Jose. Jose, I know you've been especially engaged in the Partnership for Growth with El Salvador, where crime and security is the primary focus. But it does seem that crime and security is nothing new in Salvadoran American relations. So I'll give you a similar question that I gave to the ambassador from Ghana. How is this different? And in what way is this changing the nature of U.S. Salvadoran relations? And maybe what lessons you've learned so far from the discussions?
Well, I think the way that it's different is, you've heard already how in general the PFG was different. In our case, I think the fact that we started with a constraints analysis as opposed to anecdotal evidence is critical. You know, El Salvador's crime, I would argue, is, at least historically, it's relatively new. It's something that in the last 10, 15 years has risen. It's now 10 to 15 times higher than the homicide rate, higher than the homicide rate in New York. It's a scourge. It's a real problem. But when you start with a constraints analysis, you get beyond the anecdotes and you start looking at the evidence. You start looking at the reasons for it. And another thing that it does, and I would argue that this is part of why it's different, is it creates a relationship between economists, between the government sector in both countries, that allows you to develop the trust that you will need to come up with a plan to actually tackle it. It's hard for a country to actually sit face to face with a foreign dignitary and talk about the problems in its country, and you need to have that kind of a relationship. So I would argue the constraint analysis is critical. The fact that when we looked at what we could bring to the table jointly as governments, we focused on one thing and one thing only, is how did it affect economic growth? So for example, in our case, we identified two constraints, the insecurity and the competitiveness of the Salvadorian export sector. And when we looked at issues such as education, and there are lots of, USAID and others have been working on education in El Salvador for centuries, we actually didn't look at education in general. We said, how will improving this aspect of the educational system in El Salvador contribute to tackling the two constraints, insecurity and productivity? And I think the third piece that we cannot ignore is the coordination among the agencies and how that's different. You've had in the past, and I'm sure you could find enough examples today, you've had overlap in aid programs, in assistance programs, in collaboration programs. You've also had, at least in the history that I've had with El Salvador, you've had a lot of unkept promises. And so one of the things that you can do with a coordinated USG approach is actually sit and say, okay, we know what they need, what can we deliver, what can we bring to the table? And you can start assigning responsibilities to different agencies, and you can make people accountable. And so I would argue that that's a critical part of it, the coordination among the agencies that starts with a constraints analysis and is actually responsive to two things. We could have picked 4, 5, 6, 18, but we decided to focus on 2. So I think that's how I would say that's how it's different from other programs that I've seen with respect to El Salvador.
Great, thank you, Jose. My next question is for Ambassador Altschul from the Philippines. You can take that. Sorry, El Salvador. So Jose mentioned that in addition to security, competitiveness of the export sector is another area. Now that's a very, very broad priority. There's lots of things that could be affecting export competitiveness. So I'd like to know, what's the government's view of how they're going to tackle export competitiveness? I could imagine at least a dozen things that you could do that would impact that. So how is this process helping you focus down on what within the export sector is really the binding constraints?
Sure. First, thank you for this opportunity. I would say that there are, as you said, different issues that have to do with increasing the productivity of the tradables. Some are obvious. Jose Fernandez has mentioned one very important, education. There are other ones for the point of view of the government that are also very important. One is the fiscal situation. And one of the issues that has been determined is to increase the fiscal revenue, which is one of the lowest. In the case of El Salvador, is one of the lowest in Latin America. I think this is important because, as one of the government officials in El Salvador said, one of the benefits of the Partnership for Growth, it is going to allow us to make the tough decisions that have to be made. And this has to do for the government part, but it also has to do for other sectors of society, and particularly, in this case, the private sector. And I would say that a Partnership for Growth has played an important role in building bridges and bringing together private sector and the government. This is a government that is a left of center government. There is usually certain apprehensions on the part of the business community and on the part of the government as well. And we started with having certain problems, let's say, or misunderstandings between government and private sector. And I think one of the extremely positive things that PFG has done is to create the climate and create even instruments, or allow for the creation of certain instruments that will bring together the government and the private sector, particularly, just to give you an example, the creation of the Growth Council, which is a consultative body, which includes one of, a group of the most important entrepreneurs in the country, and which are meeting in a more or less regular basis to consult and find consensus. So I think I would say that these perhaps are one of the more specific things, and I would say new, that we believe are going to end up being key components of the project.
Okay, thank you. Before I turn it to the audience for questions, I want to ask an additional question, both to the ambassador from Ghana, and then I'll ask Eric maybe if you want to comment on this, which is we heard a lot about the private sector. I think we generally hear a lot about involving the private sector more robustly, but I think we still have a shortage of workable models. What does that actually mean? Does it mean getting companies to pay for projects? Does it mean trying to get companies to come in to make investments that for some reason they otherwise wouldn't make? Mr. Ambassador, what's different about this approach that would entice an American power producer to come get involved in Ghana's power sector or in any sector in Ghana that didn't exist 6 months ago before you signed the PFG?
Well, one thing that the PFG has done is to clarify the rather confusing situation as to the role of the private sector in a development process. Through the control analysis, we try to get the private sector involved in helping government to identify those key sectors. And as I indicated, there are 4 key sectors, although we haven't come to a firm agreement through the Joint Action Plan. All the other sectors, the 3 other sectors, water and sanitation, the financial sector, of course the power sector, and the 4th one, I forget. These are areas that we are trying to encourage private investors from the United States to team up with private investors in Ghana. And as I speak, following the visit of the president, there is a group of investors. No, there is an investing group from Houston after signing the Joint Action Plan, who are visiting Ghana to discuss a program for the management of waste in Ashanti in Kumasi. Now, this is what it has done. It has explained and clarified those areas which previously were not too clear to private investors here in the United States. The Joint Action Plan has spelled out these 4 key areas, and therefore American investors are more comfortable with identifying with these 4 areas. And as I'm saying, there are others to follow the week next and thereafter. So what the PFG has done is to help both the private sector in Ghana and in the US to identify these 4 key areas. But of course, there are other areas as well. Education is also key for all societies. But for now, power generation is very key. And those in the private sector here should take advantage of this partnership to come to Ghana and seek to invest at all levels, the 3 levels, top, middle, and bottom. The major area, of course, is investing in the production, the exploration, production of oil and gas. And I'm glad to state that the American company which helped to discover oil, or the company which helped to discover oil, came from Houston. They've done a good job. And there are others to follow, and we welcome any American investor. If you have any difficulties, we have an economic section, an investment section in the embassy. Please get in touch with us, and we'll give you more details as to where to go, what you can find, and what the opportunities there are. So this is all I can say to the American investor.
All right, thank you. I feel a little bit like a broken record asking everybody, okay, wait, what's new here? But Eric, I am going to push you, if we can give the mic to Eric just one more time, is what is different here about the PFG on engagement with the private sector?
So some of it's already started and some is still to come. There's been plenty of cases where after everything's laid out, then people are told about it and said, do you want to come in at the end of the process? We've started the engagement, and by we I mean all the governments, including the United States government, right up front. So during the constraints analysis part, there was consultations in country with investors and private sector folks there, as well as here in the United States with offshore investors. And we did that through a number of mechanisms. Commerce, the Department of Commerce was heavily involved, and in several countries' cases, we got the great help of a couple different organizations, including Jerry Jensen and Jennifer Potter and their organization, where we talked to a lot of investors right up front to say, what are your inputs to the analysis, and do you think it's right? Because we wanted to hear from the people who sign checks and who invest, because you need that investment ultimately to get growth, and that's what the constraints are all about, is identifying them. So right from the beginning, we're trying to be involved with them. Now we've come up with these joint action plans, and as we work on implementing them, we need to, and it started, but we can do more. We need to work with all these different potential investors to make sure that what we're doing jointly with the governments and the societies is tackling the sub-elements, if you will, that solve the constraints. So, for example, in Ghana, if one of the issues to investment is a tariff structure that permits people to make a reasonable profit and so forth, then are the regulatory and tariff changes being made in such a way that represent the interest of civil society in Ghana, the government of Ghana, but also enable us to do power projects or whatever it might be, then constantly checking and having that dialogue all the way along as full partners. Because if we don't get that right, then you don't have the investment, and that's what we're trying collectively to drive towards. And so that would be just one example of how this would play itself out. Yes, there will still be investor conferences and the things that have been done before, but not sort of that as the end goal, but involvement and collaboration all the way through to get to these outcomes that we want.
Great, thanks, Eric. Okay, I'm going to throw it open to the audience. If you could please raise your hand. I've got Sam here first.
We're understanding that without growth, we don't have development. So that's sort of the premise behind this. And we could see how this analysis is opening up a degree of growth that would not be there without this partnership. And the question is focused really on this issue of equitable growth and inclusive growth. Oftentimes you've had growth as a capture by an elite, whether it's private sector or government. To what extent is there, through this analysis, consideration down the road of how to make the type of growth that will come through this partnership an inclusive one that will more broadly benefit your populations? Maybe perspective from the U.S. government on this and with the partner countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Nancy?
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, everyone. One of our distinguished board members, Rob Mossbacher, came in a little bit late, and I'm reminded by his presence that OPIC matters. So I have three very quick questions. First one is maybe for Gayle. I think it's great to hear this emphasis on the private sector, which is surely one of the strengths, a comparative advantage of the U.S. in the aid community to deal with how to make the private sector really a vital engine of growth. So it's a question for Gayle about, is it just a coincidence that we don't have OPIC here today? Is OPIC adequately, does it have a sufficient authorization to be really active in this process, at least in these 4 countries? And where it doesn't, does the Partnership for Growth apparatus allow for calling up IFC or other agencies? Second quick question is for Frank, because he mentioned the indicators. Could you give us, for one of the countries where it's already settled, what are the agreed indicators, 3 or 4 of them, or are there a lot? Be better if there are a few. And what's the process? Annually, a report to everybody. And then finally for Ambassador Majar, and maybe for the ambassador from Ghana. I just looked at an email telling me from a colleague in Dar that the natural gas discovery offshore in Tanzania may be worth as much as $150 billion, which is about 6 times the annual GDP of Tanzania. And this goes back a little bit to Sam's question. Is it included in the constraints to growth analysis for Tanzania? The issue of broad-based growth, the constraints to broad-based growth. And same for Ghana. Is there some thinking about how to deal with the risks of the natural resource curse, which, among others, Todd has been working on?
Thank you. Gentlemen, just in the aisle, just behind John.
Thank you so much. I am from, I'm a member of UNESCO Task Force for Culture and Creative Industries, and also regarding education. My question is, how do you integrate the cooperation with World Bank, UNESCO, and other international agencies? I'm from Norway, so Scandinavian countries are quite active. How are you going to integrate those countries in your initiative? Thank you so much.
Okay, I think why don't we turn these good questions back to our panel. Let's start with the question I really want to hear the answer to, which is from the ambassador in Tanzania about the gas discovery and how this affects the constraints to growth. And then I'll open it up if anyone else wants to answer the pro-poor growth question. And there was a good question for you, Frank, as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. The gas is part of the power, and power generation is what the first constraint that we have identified. And I think it's going to play a major role because if properly managed, it's going to take us out of the single source dependency on hydro into natural gas before we look into exporting the gas. Now, one of the things that we're doing, we are looking into how to create the regulatory regime for and capacity for negotiating the development agreements and also the sale arrangement in a way that will help us get the true benefit out of this natural resource to help contribute to the economic growth. It's critical for us because in 1996, as we came out, as we were developing our market economy from a command economy, we opened up our mineral sector in the gold sector. And at that time, we were so tainted that no one would touch us. So the fiscal regime was very, very generous, to the extent that now there is a lot of concern that is coming from the public that we sold the country unknowingly, and there is a demand to open up the development agreements. Now, we do not want to end up in that situation in this thing, and we have started discussions with our partner in the US and also our other partners. And I would like to take the opportunity again to, having said that, to respond to the other issue that was raised by you about equitable growth and how to make growth inclusive, an inclusive one. For Tanzania, we are still an agricultural country. 80% of our population still lives off the land. And one of the areas that we identified that would help the growth is agriculture. And the kind of agriculture that we're promoting is dual. We're promoting large-scale commercial farming as well as small-scale farming and subsistence farming in such a way that the large-scale agricultural farmers would be required to tag along small-scale farmers so that they can also have the same access to markets. So we have a very special program that we are now implementing, and part of it also is on the part of Partnership for Growth and food security and such related programs, which is encouraging, again, private investment into this particular area that we have set aside, we call Southern Agricultural Corridor of Tanzania, where we are seeing the program will include rural roads, rural infrastructure uplifting, so that you can allow access to market and access to the farming areas, and also extension services and support to small-scale farmers. And again, the encouragement of private investment in agriculture and agro-processing. And we think if you can tackle that, and because it affects so many people of our people, we should be able to take out quite a number of our people out of poverty. And again, it will be an economic growth which is inclusive. And we're very conscious of that, especially this current government. Because we look at our economic growth for the last 7 years, it has been very steady. It has defied even the global economic problem. But poverty is not seemingly been reduced concomitant with the economic growth. So we think if we tackle agriculture, we should be able to address that problem.
Okay, thank you. Frank, I'm going to ask you to maybe comment on Nancy's indicators question, then I'll turn to Gayle.
Thank you. I will use El Salvador as an example because I believe that's the place that we have our M&E addendum already in place and signed. The approach is one that we're not only putting in place there, but looking at how we can replicate in other countries. But the logical framework of the Joint Country Action Plan is very clear. We've identified 2 constraints to growth, and being able to measure whether those constraints are being relaxed during the duration of the program is something which will be tracked by a small number of indicators, as we have a number of indicators that reflect both the security, reflect on one hand security, and on the other hand the constraints in the productivity of the tradable sector. Now, each one of those constraints has a strategy behind it with different elements. I forget the exact number, but a handful of there are, I think, 6 goals on the tradable side, and then maybe twice that many on the security side. Now, each one of those goals itself will be linked with indicators which are meant to measure the current state of affairs within those areas and the extent to which they are being improved during the Joint Country Action Plan. Now, we know that in each of those cases, both at the constraint level and then at the goal level, it's going to be very difficult to rigorously attribute the changes at that high level to the strategic engagements, right? That said, both our partner country and the U.S. government agencies have agreed that the strategy we are putting in place is designed to improve circumstances in those areas, right? So I think it's very clear that as we will be reporting on performance both at the goal level and at the constraint level, there's a shared understanding that if we cannot demonstrate that these conditions are improving during the Joint Country Action Plan, that we will have failed in our effort, right? Or that we will have to understand in some sense how our strategy led to this outcome, right? Including perhaps the possibility that the circumstances have worsened and our outcome nonetheless is in some sense what we were looking for. Right? So at those levels, yeah.
Just so I understand, so you have 2 constraints to growth in El Salvador, for example, 18 goals, and each of those 18 goals has multiple indicators?
So we have, yes.
Okay. Does that meet your fewer is better criteria?
Well, I think that once you see it, though, I mean, again, first of all, at the constraint level, understanding whether security has gotten better or not. Yeah. There are, I think, two or three high-level indicators, which we've agreed will reflect that. Right? Okay. Now, as part of that, you can imagine on the security side, there are things ranging from the performance of police to the performance of prisons, to the judiciary, right? Now, each one of those is a separate element. So to say that we would measure, the performance on each one of those by that high-level indicator would also be, in some sense, an unfair. Mm-hmm. In fact, it would reduce our accountability to ourselves if we said we're just going to look at the homicide rate. In fact, what we need is indicators that tell us: are we achieving our strategic engagement on the management of prisons? Are we achieving our strategic engagement on the management of the judiciary? Right? And so. I guess I would say that in this particular case, we have very clear links between the goals and the constraint, and very clear indicators at the goal level, which an external audience would say that makes sense. That's what, if that goes down or if that goes up, the situation would be improving. And ultimately, to have a smaller number would in fact lead to less clarity rather than more, I think.
Great, thank you. Gayle, I'm going to ask you to talk about Nancy's question on OPIC and the IFC.
Yeah, but I'm going to...
Of course.
OPIC is not here. That's not by design. TDA is not here. EXIM's not here. USDA, Treasury, USTR.
And I thank you for that, because the stage is only so big.
Exactly. So there's no design there. OPIC has been very involved in this process and very critical. And I think it gets to an additional point I would like to make, because Todd, you've asked about the interagency process. And I think part of what the PFG is enabling us to do is align our resources. And it also gets to the private sector point and what's different. So in other words, when Ghana and Tanzania had delegations here during the Corporate Council on Africa event, and there were a number of meetings set up on energy. And the difference with this is that our Department of Energy, which you may have heard there's some things going on around the world with energy, is very focused on that strategy. But they are able to sit down with these governments talking about power constraints, but also energy potential, in a way that then is factored into a broader strategy on energy. So it's not the disaggregated actions that we sometimes see. I can only tell you that I run a lot of interagency processes, and there is no process that is more coherent or smoother than this one. And there are a lot of agencies in the room, but that doesn't seem to be a problem. But it's this alignment that's different. So I'll give you some other examples, and I would imagine our ambassadors from Ghana and Tanzania, and I would imagine all four of you would say that this has been true, that you might have a delegation that comes from the U.S. that's a trade delegation, and they come and things happen, then you know what I'm talking about. You get some progress, but maybe it's not really connected to anything else. What we're trying to do here is connect it to other things, so that the trade delegation is connected with what all these agencies are doing in the dialogue we're having with the governments. A last point I would make is on your point about inclusive growth, which obviously we think is quite important, but one of the predicates for us in thinking through what countries do we want to invite into this experiment with us had a lot to do with what do those countries think about inclusive growth. And I think, you've heard the ambassador from Ghana talk about we've got power in some places, but we've got a lot of people who don't have power. We have in the Philippines a government that very quickly stood up and said we want to tackle corruption because, as we all know, that's something that affects every person. Your comments, Ambassador, on agriculture. I think in El Salvador, to tackle the security issue in the way that you have is all about making sure that we do have this broad-based inclusion, because we all know who that affects the most. So part of what we are also counting on is that there's political leadership in these countries, which means that agency for inclusion is not just with us. Do we just design projects and make sure they're inclusive? But we have a partnership where one of the assumptions we're all going in with is to get the outcomes we want. It by definition has to be broad-based and inclusive. And so that fits, and your question on power, it's no coincidence, I don't think, that Ghana, upon discovering oil, announced that it planned to do it differently than other African countries had, and that Tanzania is doing very much the same thing on the gas side. So that's a critical ingredient here. We thought carefully about countries that really had skin in the game.
Okay. Can I ask if anyone? I'll turn to Ambassador Quisha. But I'd also like to hear, perhaps the ambassador could address us, and perhaps Jose. After all this coordination among the multiple U.S. agencies, it would seem kind of exhausting to then go out and try to coordinate with the Danes and the World Bank and everybody else. So I assume that most of that is going to fall on the laps of the host government. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I think two important words to describe the growth we're talking about is sustainable and inclusive. Because over the past 2 decades, we've had growth, respectable growth, although it's been erratic. But it has not been inclusive. And the criticism of government is that the benefits of economic growth have not trickled down to the lower income groups. And particularly certain major islands, Mindanao, for example, is the least developed of the major islands. But of course, the problem in Mindanao is the security situation. And this is why the government is now exerting all effort to come up with a comprehensive peace agreement with the groups that are, of course, against government. So there is a focused effort by government to precisely address this problem, this challenge. And so the major objective is job creation, and the sectors are looking at are infrastructure, education, and health, because these are the sectors which will generate a lot of jobs. Now, of course, to be able to do that, we must have the resources coming from the U.S. government through the Partnership for Growth, but also the government's own resources. And this is why we are very encouraged to see the focused approach that has been taken by government to ensure this sustainable and inclusive growth, to make sure that the lower income groups will benefit from all the programs and projects that will be undertaken under this PFG.
Okay, Jose.
Let me address a couple of things on inclusive growth and then the other 2 points that were mentioned. The constraints that were identified, at least with respect to El Salvador, but I suspect also at least with respect to Ghana, hit the poorest the most. If you look at security, we looked at the transport sector. Who's taking buses in El Salvador to get to work? Well, it's not the elites. And so you were focusing on the very issues that right now are keeping the poor from not getting jobs, from having their paychecks stolen on buses. And so that's one of the ways that I think we're addressing the inclusive growth issue. On the private sector, one something that I think the U.S. brought to the table, and at least with respect to El Salvador, I think the government appreciated is in many of the countries that we're dealing with, there's been a historic polarization between the private sector and the government. In El Salvador, it's no secret you have a leftist government that has not had good relations with the private sector. Well, what we did is we acted as a catalyst. We actually went to the private sector before we signed, and we said, "This is what we're doing. We need your help." And you know, you've all gone to U.S. schools. You all speak English, certainly better than I do. This is what you need to do, and this is how we will work together. So we acted as a catalyst, as a bridge. On the donor side, on the third country side, one of the things that we were very aware of is that there were other players in the game. So after each of our meetings, we would meet with governments, we would meet with NGOs, and we would say two things. Number one is we do not want to duplicate what you're doing. And so we need to know what you're doing so that we can tailor our agreement accordingly. And secondly, we want you to stay in the game. We do not want you to use the Partnership for Growth as a reason to move on to other countries. And so we were very aware, at least with respect to El Salvador, that we needed to coordinate with the donor community.
Thank you. All right, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to take. I promise I'll give you a chance, Mr. Ambassador. Why don't we take just two questions? I've got somebody there, the woman all the way at the back. Steph, can you reach? Just pass that over.
Thank you very much. John Cavanna from the Institute for Policy Studies. I wanted to ask a question. I've spent a lot of time in the last year with small farmers in both El Salvador and the Philippines. So I mentioned to several of them I'd be coming to this and asked their question. So here's a question. It actually starts with you, Gayle. The question was, would they be open to changing the title of this from Partnership to Growth to Partnership for Clean Water and Well-Being? The meaning of that was both of them said a key, perhaps the key constraint to well-being in those two countries is massive pollution of groundwater, heavily polluted by private investment in many cases. In both countries, a lot by gold mining and extractive industries. So the question I would have is, how does that set up, the fact that a lot of investment does not support sustainable and inclusive growth the way you've all described it, how did those concerns from those sorts of people, the people who are supposed to be at the bottom of the trickle down, get factored into these dialogues?
Okay, thank you. The back.
Thanks. Hi, Lisa Friedman with Climate Wire. And I think maybe my question dovetails with this gentleman's. I'm afraid I'm one of the few people here probably who isn't deeply versed in this new model, but you know, climate change is clearly a problem in most, if not all, of the countries represented here. It's now, I think, kind of squarely seen as a development issue and often an impediment to growth. Can someone, and I suppose this is for anyone who wants to take it, speak to how this new model works in the climate space, if at all? I mean, is there a discussion as these conversations are happening about the power sector and other areas about how to address some of the vulnerabilities that countries face or clean energy? Thanks.
Okay, and John, if you promise to keep it very short, I'll let you have the last question. Ted, just up here on the aisle.
I won't even bother to get up in that case. I've got two questions for you.
How about one?
Huh? Well, they're related, but I'll do just one, okay? Who's in charge? Who is in charge of this whole process? Now, Gayle may have 60 people in the bottom of the executive office building working for her, but I doubt it. So who really is in charge? Because somebody has to be. And in this discussion, the absence of discussion of Treasury and of trade policy under this is striking, because those are much more important to development than some of the things that USAID is going to do.
Okay, good. Thank you, John. Gayle, do you want to take that right off?
Yeah, and just to be, it's nice to see you, John. And John, no, but I think couple things. None of this obviates what we're doing on trade policy or treasury policy or anything of the sort. Those agencies are in the room. What we are trying to do in part as a government is overcome the disaggregation of our various sets of policies, right? Because I am not persuaded, I don't think any of us are persuaded when we did the study, that our stovepiping, which many of you have heard me call affectionately our cylinders of excellence, serves our partners. Because there is no country that doesn't have to deal with fiscal policy, with climate change, with clean water, with security, with energy, with this whole host of things. And if you look at the development landscape, I mean, you talked about unruliness. There is a lot of unruliness. So none of this says that AID's work is the most important and Treasury's doesn't matter. It's an effort to bring these things together, to identify with our partners a small set of priorities that we think are going to have significant impact on a number of other things. Now, John, to your question, there is no question but that clean water is critical in any of these countries. There's no question but that health is. There's no question but that scaling innovation would be a game changer. There is no question that gender is a huge factor, that minority rights, that land tenure. What we concluded, and this is we're trying something different, was that development whereby we all divided up in the government and said, let's each take one of those things, wasn't actually getting the outcomes that we hoped. That's number one. Number two, there are any number of other ways that we as a government, with the 60 people John refers to, I have Rio coming up, the Open Government Partnership coming up, and those things we hope will increasingly inform this and give us a platform where, if nothing else, we can reduce the management burden we impose on some of our partners by pulling these things together. And the last thing I would say, just on a partnership for growth, there are a lot of things we could have called this, and we all know about things like the Global Agricultural and Food Security Program, that we in the development community are able to name things poorly. I mean, the GAPS. I think one of the things we heard from our partners is that, like any other country in the world, they wanted sustainable growth. That's part of what their goal was. So that's not to say growth at the expense of everything else, nor is it to say that none of those other things matter. I think the challenge will be over time is if we can transform all of our cylinders of excellence into a platform for really driving with everything we've got in such a way that we get outcomes across all those areas. But as I say, it's early days and we'll see where it goes.
Great. I promised the ambassador from Ghana the opportunity to speak, so he's going to have the last word. I want to end on time. Everyone will be around if you want to pigeonhole him for additional questions. But Mr. Ambassador.
Well, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First, I think two of the contributors talked about the broad-based growth and the fact that whether the PFG has been of benefit only to the elite or certain segments of the society. I think these are linked, and I think this is a very important issue. Obviously, for us as an emerging economy, the tendency has been for growth, development to be concentrated on the major urban communities. And as I indicated, it is important that having identified the power sector as a major area to concentrate on, it is important that we make sure that our rural communities do have access to power. And just to link this up with the issue raised by the lady at the back, what this means is that for the environment, if we can generate power from oil and gas and transmit the electricity to these other parts, it will stop rural communities from degrading the forests that we have, using the wood as sources of fuel and all that. And it also helps us to identify other areas, alternative areas of sources of power. green sources of power, biogas, wind, solar, and all that. So we couldn't describe these in detail, but these are all part of the contribute to our development, which have been identified in this partnership. Now, we haven't talked about the issue of ownership. I think it's important that we stress that it's what is new about this. From all the other previous aid programs and whatever partnerships we had, is that we, certainly for us in Ghana, we brought to this partnership our own sense of what we need, what were our constraints. We did the analysis in consultations with the NGOs and other civil society organizations. We even reached out to get to react to the gentleman on his head. We reached out to Norway to find out what they did with the oil and gas resources. So we did a very extensive search for answers, identifying the constraints and being able to provide our own sense of what we need to bring to bear on this partnership. So we own it. We think we do. And we are sharing that ownership with the United States.
All right, well, I want to, I think as moderator, it was my role to be a little bit skeptical, but I do want to end by really applauding Gayle, her colleagues, all of the esteemed ambassadors here for embarking on what we need in our engagement in the world, which is more experimentation, more risk-taking. The MCC was an experiment that I think the United States is rightly very proud of. It's possible that Partnership for Growth could be another successful experiment in changing the way that the U.S. government does business with its partners around the world. And I think we could all applaud and wish you good luck and hope that it succeeds and that we can check in with you in a year or two and see how it's going. So with that, can we thank all of our speakers?